When Donald Trump exited the presidency, few expected him to fade quietly into the background. Yet the spectacle that followed was not what most anticipated, not rallies or immediate campaigns, but a peculiar, unsettling stillness. Trump watched the world from Mar-a-Lago, not with the bitterness of a man defeated, but with the keen, predatory patience of someone who knew the next great shift wasn't coming from elections or political parties. It would come from something deeper, something older than any constitution, the basic currency of human behavior, loyalty, and perception. And so as the world stumbled through pandemic aftershock, political polarization, and institutional decay, Trump began to draft a doctrine not for America, not for a political party, but for the world itself. The first pillar of this doctrine was a brutal observation. The traditional power structures were crumbling. Governments were bloated, slow, incapable of responding to crises with the agility the modern world demanded. Political parties, once ideological titans, were now hollow brands, clinging to slogans that no longer inspired action. The media, once the gatekeeper of truth, had cannibalized itself into irrelevance, either fragmented into partisan echo chambers, or devoured by the very algorithms they once decried. Global alliances like NATO, the UN, and the EU institutions that had defined order since World War II were showing cracks, their lofty ideals withering under the pressure of nationalism, populism, and digital warfare. In every direction Trump looked, he saw obsolete structures gasping for relevance. It was a unique moment in history, an institutional void. And in voids, new orders are born. Trump didn't see chaos as a problem. He saw it as a canvas. From his vantage point, it was obvious. The modern era was not about flags or constitutions. It was about networks. Digital, financial, ideological networks, interconnected loyalty webs that transcended geography and law. Influence no longer flowed from armies and laws, but from attention, from culture, from tribal allegiance. A viral meme could shift more political will than a Senate bill. A viral personality could command more loyalty than a political party. Traditional leaders still clung to the notion that legitimacy flowed from elections, treaties, and historical continuity. But Trump had lived through the pivot point. He had won a presidency by mastering attention over policy, loyalty over ideology. He realized that in the 21st century, optics were ontology. If people believed something was real, it was real. And if power appeared legitimate, it was legitimate regardless of how it was attained. The global order, he concluded, was not being overthrown by military conquest. It was eroding under the weight of its own obsolescence. No armies were needed to defeat it. Only networks of influence operating faster than bureaucratic response times. Only allegiances built not on ideology but on identity. In this new world, trust in traditional power was collapsing. But loyalty to symbols was skyrocketing. Political logos became cult brands. National flags became tribal banners. Elections became ritualistic spectacles necessary for legitimacy, but ultimately cosmetic. What mattered was control of perception, and perception was controlled by whoever dominated the networks. Trump saw the opportunity. Why waste time on slow, fragile institutions when you could build networks that moved at the speed of social media, of viral emotion, of fear and hope amplified by algorithms? The Trump Doctrine 2.0 would not seek to reform the old system. It would seek to replace it silently, invisibly, inevitably. He didn't need laws to change. He needed attention economies to favor him. He didn't need military coups. He needed narrative control to shift loyalties beneath the surface. And so, while legacy politicians and pundits debated policy minutiae and institutional preservation, Trump began to sketch the framework of a new world. One where nation-states were less important than tribes of loyalty, where legislation was less important than narrative momentum, where truth was less important than perception management. This wasn't conspiracy, it was evolution. The old ways were too slow, too bureaucratic, too democratic. The future belonged to those who could build loyalty systems faster than nations could hold elections, faster than courts could adjudicate, faster than journalists could fact-check. And loyalty, Trump understood, wasn't about reason or debate. It was about identity. It was about making people feel that their loyalty was who they were, not what they believed. In a chaotic, uncertain world, people didn't want freedom. They wanted certainty, belonging, meaning. Traditional governments couldn't provide that anymore. Networks could. And Trump was already building them, quietly, efficiently, relentlessly. The world's old order wasn't dying from violence. It was dying from irrelevance. And Trump was ready to usher in what came next, not as a politician, but as the architect of the new power one, not bounded by flags or laws, but by loyalty, perception, and network sovereignty. The Trump Doctrine 2.0 wasn't formalized with press conferences or white papers. There were no public declarations, no handshakes before marble podiums. Like all powerful things in the 21st century, it spread quietly, virally, passed not through legislation but through culture. Beneath the chaos of headlines and political theater, Trump had distilled power down to its essence and re-engineered it for a new age. The doctrine wasn't a political ideology. It was a system of control, built on 5 core tenets that would forever change how influence worked. First, loyalty over legitimacy. In the old world, leaders sought legitimacy through elections, laws, and traditions. In the new world, legitimacy was irrelevant without loyalty. Trump understood that loyalty was not rational, it was tribal. People didn't stay loyal because of policy positions or economic outcomes. They stayed loyal because loyalty became tied to their identity. To attack Trump was to attack themselves. This was the first and most crucial pillar. Win the person, not the policy debate. Second, attention is currency. Money, territory, even military might all still mattered. But attention was now the primary currency of power. Without attention, you were invisible. Without attention, you were irrelevant. Trump had proven this in his rise-dominating news cycles, driving narratives, weaponizing outrage and adoration alike. The Doctrine 2.0 demanded total mastery of attention flows. Not just from media, but from tech platforms, micro-influencers, and decentralized information streams. Attention wasn't just visibility, it was validation. If you controlled attention, you didn't have to convince people. They would conform to the narrative they couldn't escape. Third, narrative over truth. Truth was malleable in the information age. There was no single truth-only competing narratives. Traditionalists fought over facts. Trump's doctrine taught a different lesson. Facts don't matter if you control the story. The Doctrine 2.0 didn't wage war on truth directly. It flooded the zone with narrative supremacy, conflicting truths, half-truths, emotional truths layered until objective reality collapsed under the weight of subjectivity. The result wasn't ignorance, it was exhaustion. Exhausted people stop questioning, exhausted people follow. Fourth, network over nation. Flags, borders, nationalities, useful symbols. But secondary to the real battleground networks. Networks were supranational. They transcended geography. They connected like-minded individuals into loyalty ecosystems networks, based not on citizenship but on identity, belief, and allegiance. Networks could be grown faster than nations could be governed. They could be adapted, fragmented, scaled globally. And once a network reached critical mass, it could govern itself without needing elections or legal systems. Fifth, speed over process. The old world moved at the pace of lawmaking, diplomacy, and bureaucracy. The new world moved at the pace of virality. If a scandal took months to investigate, but a meme could rewrite public perception in 24 hours, who really controlled reality? Trump knew process was the Achilles heel of legacy power. Slow institutions couldn't compete with fast-moving loyalty networks. The Doctrine 2.0 demanded velocity-swift narrative pivots, instant mobilization, rapid loyalty reinforcement. Delay was death. Hesitation was surrender. Sixth, the silent sixth principle, legibility is a weakness. Traditional power prided itself on being legible constitutions, treaties, institutions. But if enemies could see you, they could plan against you. The Trump Doctrine 2.0 embraced opacity. Operate through influence, not hierarchy. Through loyalty, not bureaucracy. Through decentralized networks, not centralized authority. If you couldn't be pinned down, you couldn't be toppled. This is why the doctrine spread quietly, why its fingerprints were invisible even as its influence became ubiquitous. Trump never wrote these tenets down. He never needed to. They lived in his methods, in his campaigns, in his governance, in his post-presidency actions, and soon, they lived in the strategies of populists across the globe. In corporate boardrooms, in tech startup incubators, in social movements both benign and dangerous. The Trump Doctrine 2.0 wasn't just a political strategy. It was a new operating system for power in the 21st century. One built not for stability but for domination, not for justice, but for control, not for democracy, but for loyalty management. The genius of it was that it didn't require Trump to be in office, or even alive to function. It was self-sustaining, a viral code of power that, once written into the system, couldn't be deleted, only adapted, only evolved. And so, as the world scrambled to maintain old structures, Trump had already moved beyond them, rewriting the rules of engagement for an era where networks, narratives, and loyalty mattered more than any constitution ever could. Trump didn't announce the creation of his new power structure. There were no ribbon cuttings, no manifestos. It simply began to appear. Like a sprawling city without blueprints, its foundations hidden beneath the surface. The Trump Doctrine 2.0 wasn't just a set of ideas. It became the scaffolding for an entirely new architecture of influence. One that operated in the shadows of traditional institutions but grew far faster, more agile and infinitely more resilient. The first layer was personal branding. In the old world, power was tied to institutions. In the new world, it was tied to personality. Trump had become more than a politician. He was an icon, a symbol of identity. His brand transcended party lines, transcended national borders. It was woven into merchandise, into hashtags, into memes, into viral videos. It wasn't just political. It was cultural. Through relentless media saturation, Trump ensured that his image, polarizing, electrifying, could outlast any election cycle. You couldn't scroll, swipe, or flip channels without encountering him. He was omnipresent. Next came the loyalty networks. These weren't formal organizations with bylaws or charters. They were self-organizing ecosystems bound by allegiance, not membership cards, online forums, encrypted chat groups. Decentralized fundraising platforms all became nodal points in a loyalty lattice. The structure was organic, hydra-headed, shut down one channel, and 3 more would appear. The beauty of it was its resilience. Without centralized leadership, there was no head to cut off. Each node adapted, evolved, mutated based on its environment. Offline, the loyalty networks mirrored their digital counterparts. Pop-up political rallies, meetups, decentralized think tanks, media ventures. Influencers emerged not elected or appointed, but anointed by the network's collective attention. Micro-leaders, micro-generals in a cultural insurgency. Some ran for office. Some built media empires. Some simply amplified the doctrine through podcasts, newsletters, and viral outrage. Then came the corporate bridge. Trump's network extended tentacles into the business world. Corporations that once treated politics as radioactive began to realize, align with loyalty and you gain untouchable markets. Executives started making subtle shifts, quiet donations, board appointments of aligned figures, advertising strategies tilted toward narratives that echoed Trump's values: nationalism, loyalty, disruption, strength. It wasn't about ideology. It was about profit through tribal allegiance. Consumer loyalty became indistinguishable from political loyalty. This bridge between business and influence formed a new merchant-class corporate actors who didn't just sell products, but shaped culture itself. Media restructuring was next. Trump didn't try to control legacy outlets. He bypassed them. Alt media exploded, decentralized news platforms, independent YouTubers, podcasters with audiences rivaling traditional broadcasters. The Doctrine 2.0 spread not top-down but horizontally, peer-to-peer, virally. Narrative warfare became a decentralized militia movement. Each piece of content was a bullet, each meme, a skirmish, each viral video, a battle won or lost. The old media ecosystem, burdened by fact-checking and editorial oversight, couldn't compete. Speed was supremacy, accuracy was secondary to narrative loyalty. Finally, the most critical layer, global nodes. Trump's doctrine wasn't confined to American borders. He cultivated relationships with foreign leaders not through embassies and diplomats, but through shared tactics. Populist leaders, nationalist movements, authoritarian regimes with a tech-savvy twist. They didn't need formal alliances. They shared a blueprint, a doctrine, a new manual for post-democratic governance. Trump's ideas networked loyalty, narrative control, personality-based power migrated. They mutated into local versions in Europe, South America, Asia. Wherever traditional institutions failed, the Trump Doctrine 2.0 took root. Governments began subtly shifting, not through coups or revolutions, through cultural realignment, through loyalty metrics instead of democratic legitimacy, through attention economies instead of legal frameworks. What emerged was a new global lattice of influence. No official headquarters, no presidents or prime ministers, only networks, loyalty ecosystems, narrative syndicates, a new power architecture where elections, laws, and treaties were theater background noise to the real games being played beneath the surface. Trump had built something bigger than a presidency, bigger than a political party. He had built a civilization layer, a shadow operating system for the 21st century. One that could survive without him, one that didn't need a title or a ballot or a law, only loyalty, only networks. Only narratives strong enough to replace reality itself. And the world, busy clinging to its crumbling institutions, barely noticed it being installed beneath their feet. The Trump Doctrine 2.0 was never meant to stay within American borders. From the moment it took root, it was designed to spread an ideological software update for a world desperate for new operating instructions. As traditional institutions faltered under the weight of pandemics, economic shocks, and social fragmentation, the leaders who survived weren't the ones who clung to old playbooks. They were the ones who adapted, who recognized the Trump Doctrine not as a threat, but as a survival guide. The first to pivot were the populists already in power. Leaders from Eastern Europe to South America saw the blueprint and understood it instinctively. They adopted loyalty ecosystems. They bypassed traditional media with direct-to-people messaging. They flooded attention markets with relentless narrative streams. Elections still happened, but outcomes were predetermined not by rigging votes, but by rigging loyalty. Control the narratives, control the loyalty networks, and the ballots followed naturally. But the doctrine didn't just appeal to politicians. Corporations recognized the model too. CEOs saw that consumer loyalty could be weaponized the same way political loyalty was. Brands stopped selling products, they sold identities. Nike didn't just sell shoes, it sold belonging. Tesla didn't just sell cars, it sold revolutionary membership. Corporations morphed into cultural tribes, cultivating brand-loyal communities indistinguishable from political movements. Loyalty metrics launched the realm of campaign. Managers became the domain of marketing executives. Data was king. Sentiment analysis replaced polling. Narrative engineering replaced advertising. This wasn't capitalism as usual. It was network capitalism. In Asia, tech giants adapted faster than governments. Super apps, already omnipresent, began embedding loyalty programs tied not just to purchases but to behavior. Attend the right events, post the right messages, engage with the right content, and you were rewarded. Dissent? Not punished outright, just demoted, deplatformed, shadowed. Social credit systems became the real governance models, bypassing outdated constitutions and parliaments. Loyalty wasn't just monitored, it was programmed. In Africa and South America, where weak states had long struggled with governance, the Trump Doctrine 2.0 offered a shortcut. Build loyalty networks before building functioning governments. Create alternative economies based on allegiance and tribal branding. Govern not through law, but through narrative legitimacy. Infrastructure projects, healthcare systems, even educational programs became loyalty reward. Pipelines benefits tied to tribal identification, not citizenship. Even opposition groups and activists began to adopt the model. Grassroots movements realized they didn't need to appeal to reason or fact. They needed attention first, loyalty second. Facts could follow or not. The sequence was inverted. The doctrine transcended ideology. Left-wing, right-wing, nationalist, globalist, it didn't matter. Whoever mastered networks, attention. And narrative won, period. Governments that resisted were either toppled or forced to adapt. Global alliances crumbled. The EU, struggling to enforce unity, found itself outmaneuvered by national leaders who realized that Brussels couldn't compete with a loyalty ecosystem weaponized by cultural identity. The UN became a forum for speeches, not action. NATO, a relic struggling to justify itself in a world where wars were waged not with bombs, but with algorithms and narratives. The shift was so subtle most people didn't even notice. Life, for the average citizen, didn't change dramatically at first. They still voted. They still shopped. They still posted on social media. But beneath it all, the rules had changed. Voting was performance. Shopping was tribal identification. Posting was loyalty signaling. Reality itself was now filtered through network affiliation. Who you were was determined by what you believed, and what you believed was shaped by the narratives you consumed. Trump himself faded into the background, not irrelevant, but foundational. He was no longer a political figure. He was the author of the framework. The doctrine didn't require his constant presence. It was self-replicating, self-sustaining, self-adapting. It evolved as it spread, mutating to fit local conditions but never losing its core tenets: loyalty, narrative supremacy, attention dominance, network sovereignty, and speed over process. In every corner of the globe, leaders, CEOs, influencers, and even insurgent groups began playing by the new rules. Not because they were forced to, because they had to. Because in a world accelerating toward fragmentation and uncertainty, the Trump Doctrine 2.0 wasn't just a strategy. It was the only game left to play. As the Trump Doctrine 2.0 spread like an unseen virus through the arteries of global power, resistance inevitably mounted. Legacy institutions, the old world's proud guardians, tried to fight back. Governments passed regulations. International bodies convened urgent summits. Newspapers published editorials warning of creeping authoritarianism. Universities hosted symposiums defending truth and democracy. But the old guard was fighting with shields in an era of lasers. They hadn't yet realized the battlefield had moved, and so had the rules. Elections were the first to suffer. Traditional parties clung to policy debates and economic plans, thinking voters still cared. But voters were already operating inside loyalty ecosystems, where narrative and identity mattered more than policy details. Campaign ads were swatted aside by viral videos, memes, loyalty tests embedded into every social interaction. Fact checks, they collapsed under the sheer velocity of narrative saturation. In the Trumpian model, the fact didn't matter if the feeling had already taken root. Meanwhile, legacy media, the once mighty gatekeepers of information, found themselves outflanked. Their stories, carefully sourced and fact-checked, lost to rage-click headlines, and 5-second sound bites engineered for emotional virality. Investigative journalism, the gold standard of the old world, became an artifact, too slow, too cautious, too boring for attention markets that rewarded instant, visceral reactions. Newspapers and networks slashed budgets, viewership plummeted. Trust eroded beyond repair. People no longer believed in neutral information. They believed in narratives that validated their loyalty. Universities, once the breeding ground for free thought, fared no better. Attempts to teach critical thinking were drowned out by loyalty narratives that promised clarity in a chaotic world. Why wrestle with complex ideas when loyalty offered certainty? Why question when you could belong? Graduates no longer exited campuses with a belief in reasoned debate. They exited as foot soldiers for their respective narrative armies. Global alliances strained and then splintered. The United Nations issued statements. NATO tried to modernize. The European Union launched campaigns to shore up democratic values, but these institutions were built for an era where geopolitics moved slowly, where a border dispute took months to escalate, where a treaty negotiation could take years. Now, a meme could spark a revolution in a day. An influencer could topple a government faster than any army. The old institutions were simply too slow. Their processes, once their strength, became their downfall. Bureaucratic inertia was no match for viral loyalty. Economic systems stumbled next. Global capitalism had been designed to withstand wars, recessions, and natural disasters. It was not designed for a fragmented loyalty economy. Markets no longer moved purely on financial fundamentals. They moved on narrative shifts. A CEO's political alignment could tank a stock faster than a quarterly loss. Entire industries became loyalty battlegrounds. Companies that aligned with dominant narratives thrived. Those that didn't were boycotted, canceled, shamed into irrelevance. The old idea of free markets died, replaced by narrative markets, where allegiance determined valuation more than supply and demand. Legal systems tried to intervene, antitrust lawsuits, hate speech regulations, content moderation laws, but laws moved at the speed of government. Narratives moved at the speed of attention. Every attempt to regulate the new world was outpaced, outflanked, rendered irrelevant before the ink on the legislation dried. Even the military-industrial complex, long the backbone of global power, found itself in an unfamiliar position, obsolete. Why wage wars that cost billions when you could wage narrative wars for free? Why bomb cities when you could fracture societies from within using only information, culture, and loyalty? The generals trained for battlefield dominance. But the battlefield was now inside every smartphone, inside every newsfeed, inside every fragmented community loyal to their own curated realities. By the time the old world realized it was losing, it was already too late. The institutions didn't collapse in a blaze of revolutions or uprisings. They simply became irrelevant, ignored, bypassed, replaced by networks, loyalty ecosystems, and narrative syndicates that owed no allegiance to flags, constitutions, or laws. The old world didn't fall, it was forgotten. Overwritten by a new operating system of influence and allegiance, installed without consent, without resistance, because it offered something better than democracy ever could: certainty, belonging, identity, the very things the old world, in all its complexity and pluralism, could no longer provide. And Trump? He watched it unfold, not from a seat of power, but from the sidelines and architect content to let his blueprint build itself. He didn't have to lift a finger. The doctrine was self-sustaining. The collapse of the old world was not an end. It was a beginning. By the time historians tried to make sense of the transformation, it was already too late to reverse. The Trump Doctrine 2.0 had not just shifted the landscape of politics, it had rewired the DNA of global power. Institutions built over centuries now sat hollow, their facades preserved like museum pieces, while the real power flowed through networks of loyalty, perception, and narrative supremacy. The world hadn't been conquered in the traditional sense. It had been reprogrammed. In this new reality, power was no longer territorial. It was no longer confined by geography, constitutions, or treaties. Power resided in networks, organic, fluid, invisible, stretching across borders, economies, and ideologies. To control a network was to control reality itself. And Trump's greatest achievement was recognizing that early. The presidency had been a mere stepping stone. His real legacy was the operating system he left behind. Influence without authority, allegiance without borders. Governance without governance. The hallmarks of the old world elections. Laws, parliaments became ceremonies. Rituals to placate populations still tethered to outdated notions of sovereignty. But real decisions were made elsewhere, in loyalty groups, in private channels, in decentralized nodes of influence that owed no allegiance to flags or official titles. The old political spectrum left-right, liberal, conservative, collapsed under the weight of identity networks. What mattered now was tribal alignment, not what you believed, but who you believed in. Not what policies you supported, but what narratives you consumed. Corporations no longer just sold products. They sold belonging. Governments no longer just legislated. They managed loyalty markets. Citizens no longer just voted. They performed acts of network allegiance liking, sharing, defending their tribe across digital and real-world battlefields. Education systems, once focused on cultivating critical thought, shifted toward tribal reinforcement. Students learned not how to think, but what to believe to stay in the good graces of their loyalty ecosystem. Even war changed. Kinetic wars faded. Narrative wars became the true frontlines. Campaigns fought through memes, viral videos, deepfakes, and loyalty-driven propaganda. A single viral narrative could do more damage to a nation-state than 1,000 missiles. Reality became a matter of consensus, not fact. Truth became tribal property. And once truth was fragmented, governance by consent became impossible. What emerged in its place was governance by alignment, an invisible contract of belonging, where loyalty guaranteed access to resources, safety, and meaning. The very foundations of democracy, deliberation, debate, compromise eroded, replaced by network hegemony, where the strongest, fastest, most emotionally resonant networks absorbed or crushed the rest. Global alliances reconfigured, old treaties dissolved. New fluid network alliances formed not between countries, but between loyalty blocks that transcended borders. A leader in Brazil could be more closely aligned with a corporate titan in the U.S., or a tech mogul in Southeast Asia than with his own legislature. Diplomacy became network management. Economics became loyalty optimization. Culture became narrative warfare, and in the background of it all, Trump's shadow loomed not as a man but as a system. His name faded from headlines, but his framework endured. He had been the first to understand the obsolescence of traditional power, the first to operationalize loyalty at scale, the first to weaponize attention as the true currency of influence. And that understanding, simple, brutal, effective, outlived him. Outlived the nation-state. Outlived the old definitions of democracy, sovereignty, and governance. Trump didn't leave behind monuments or libraries. He left behind something far more permanent, a new definition of power, one that didn't need armies or laws, one that didn't need elections or constitutions, one that needed only the deep, instinctive human hunger for belonging, certainty, and identity. The Trump Doctrine 2.0 wasn't a chapter in history. It was the operating system of the future.